Last week we began a journey using the life of Moses from the Old Testament of the Bible to discuss what is actually the title of this series, called Living a Life of Purpose. And the message today is personal circumstances. So last week was outside circumstances. We'll touch on some of that. But the big thing I need everybody to grasp onto is every single one of us, every person that is alive, not just Christians, but non-Christians alike, every person has a purpose or a call from God on their life. Not everyone ever answers those calls. Sometimes we allow, and many, or maybe even most of the time, we allow circumstances control what we think we can or should do, rather than looking to God on what our purpose is in life. And some people, they don't even find out what their true purpose in life is until many years have gone by. And so taking a look at the life of Moses, he lived to be 120 years old, and there was something going on in his life throughout all 120 years, and his biggest moments happened in the last 40 years of those 120. And some folks in here, anybody in here that are 80 or older? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of you. Imagine God calling you right now to go lead an entire nation out of slavery. What would you say if you had an encounter with God on the top of a mountain and He's like, I'm going to send you to set your people free? Some of us, if you know the story in great detail, we would be the same as Moses was. You got the wrong person. Yeah, no, not me today. I'm old and frail. I don't really want to do this. And so, but Moses' life was just about to get exciting. But it took him 80 years to get there. And as we talked about last week, the beginnings of Moses' life, the very beginnings were completely out of his control. These outside circumstances that were dictating the events of his life, he had no control over, because all he had done was, he had been born. He got shoved in a basket and thrown down the river, all to try and save his life. Nothing about this, nothing about his situation was anything that he could control. But God still had a purpose for his life. And only a very few that were involved would even have an inkling that God was maybe doing something in Moses' life. But time goes along. You see, we have to be careful not to let our circumstances define our purpose. We talked last week about how outside circumstances can impact our lives. And because we have no control over these circumstances, sometimes they can be devastating, and it is how we respond or react to those circumstances that can determine the next steps of our life. While Moses had outside forces trying to destroy him, God was taking care of him all the way. And what's really cool is that God is taking care of every single one of us all the way through. I think my wife shared a little picture on Facebook the other day. I've seen it a million times over many years. Most of us have heard that footprints in the sand poem, and there was two sets of footprints, and then there was only one set of footprints, and the person is like, "Where were you, God?" And he says, "Well, that was where I was carrying you." And then the little picture that my wife put on, it showed one set of footprints and just this groove in the sand. And he said, well, what was that, God? He says, that's where I had to drag you through. You go and read the story of Jonah, and you get to see a story of a man that got dragged through. Right? But sometimes that's how we feel in our life, as we're being dragged through, and we don't have any control over the circumstances of our lives. But then there's those circumstances that we bring on ourselves. Personal circumstances, personal choices. And that can really define who we are. Our personal choices really define the direction of our life. You see, we don't have control of our outside circumstances, but our personal circumstances, our personal choices that we make, regardless of what's going on outside, will determine the direction of our life. But sometimes we goof up so bad that we get to a place where we think that there is no hope. There's just no coming back from what you've done. You can never be good enough. Have you ever had anyone say that to you or felt that way? Where you feel as if you have messed up so bad, you have done so many things, or even if it wasn't so many things, it was just one big thing that you did wrong, and you feel like you'll never recover from what happened. Well, this is where Moses is at. But I want to tell you today, you cannot let even your personal circumstances define the direction that God has for your life. Because your personal circumstances, do not deter your purpose. When God has a purpose for your life, God has a purpose for your life, and it doesn't matter what other people say. It doesn't even matter what you say. It doesn't matter the choices that you made. It doesn't matter if you just keep running. God still has a purpose for your life. Now, you can make a choice to not follow that purpose at all. So don't get me wrong. I'm not going to go into the Calvinist view of that you have no say-so in your life. You know, that you're just called and you had no choice in that. All people are called. But very few will choose to follow what God has for them in their life. But God still has a purpose for every person. And so Moses' choices didn't deter God's purpose for his life. And neither did time. Moses was 80 years old when he had an encounter with God on the top of the mountain with the burning bush. 80. It took him a long time to get to 80. I just turned 46 a few weeks ago. I'm hoping that 80 is still a little ways away. I hope I make it. Or the rapture happens. I'm good with the rapture. I'm rapture ready. If you want to take a look at the bulletin, I put that in there. A devotion from Jonathan Thacker that he put together, being rapture ready. But time does not necessarily define your circumstance. And your personal choices, does not define your purpose. And your personal choices do not necessarily define your purpose. Your outside circumstances do not necessarily define your purpose. Many of us need to get this in our brain. When God has called you for a purpose, no man can tell you that you are not called. Now we're going to understand the direction of our called purpose in later messages, because I just need you to understand this is something that you want to take out of this. You want to write this down. You want to implant it in post a tweet or a meme or a whatever. Just understand this, that your call or your purpose in life rarely unfolds the way that you think it should. But when you have a purpose, neither your outside circumstances or your personal circumstances nor time will stop that purpose if God has truly called you into it. It rarely unfolds the way that you think it should. 20 years old. I was called into ministry. It was the beginning of a year. I believe it was in the springtime of the year I was 20. I don't remember what year that was. It was a couple days ago. I was called into ministry. My life was on track for everything God was calling me in to do, and everything was going great. By the time I turned 21, my whole world had been flipped upside down and crashed and burned, and I ran from God for 7 years. But I had a call in my life. I had a call in my life, had a purpose for my life. God had created me with a purpose, and for years I was told I would never be able to fulfill that purpose because just because God called you to something doesn't mean you're going to be able to do it because you've messed up too bad, Travis. You'll never make it. You'll never be a pastor. There's no way. It's kind of cool that I get to stand up here and be a pastor and a preacher and do all these amazing things that God has called me to do because God called me to do it. Some really bad decisions on my part and some outside circumstances and decisions on other people's part, I allowed those things to dictate my life for more than the 7 years I ran from God. Though during those 7 years I ran from God, and it wasn't until I stopped running that God got me back on track and started leading me down a new path. 20 years old, I was called into ministry. I was 35 when I became the pastor of my first church, and 39 when I got credentials with the Assemblies of God. Time didn't matter. The circumstances didn't matter. All that mattered was the purpose that God had for my life. What kind of purpose does God have for your life? Well, what about Moses? You think that you've done some bad stuff in your life? I mean, we know that Moses eventually ends up having this encounter with God on the mountain, and then for 40 years, for a short time, he leads the people of Israel out of Egypt, and then for 40 years, they wander around in the desert, and he's leading these crazy folks, and he's doing all of this amazing and crazy stuff that God's called him to in his purpose in life. But if we go back a little ways, maybe we would think that he wasn't really called to be the man that God called him to be. You see, here's this story in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 11. It says this. One day, when Moses had grown up, okay, so he's 40. Just throw that out there. One day when Moses had grown up. It took him that long. We're wondering why kids don't grow up today. Moses was 40 and he finally gets called a grown up by God. How cool is that? Some of us still haven't reached grown up stage yet. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Uh-oh. Busted. Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. The beginning story of Moses is really kind of short, just a couple chapters, chapter 1 and 2, that leads into what's getting ready to happen. He was born, crazy birth, outside circumstances he couldn't control, cast in a river, rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, still being able to be raised by his mother and in his family, but seemingly to be raised in the lap of luxury as an Egyptian. All to 40 years later, now he's all grown up. He's got some pretty strong feelings about what's going on. He's getting tired of watching his people. He knows that they're his people. He's getting tired of watching his people be oppressed and to be slaves. Excuse me. He's getting tired of watching them hurt and suffer. And one day he's just had enough. And in a moment, he makes a choice that is going to redirect his life. That's going to devastate everything that he has known and has been a part of. It is going to totally destroy the direction that he's going. He murders a guy. In the middle of a midlife crisis, that might be what we would call it today. He didn't buy himself a Corvette. He didn't just go get a funky hairdo. He got fed up to here with what was going on, took matter into his own hands, and he struck down a man and killed him. And then he tried to hide it. He buried him in the sand. Moses was now a murderer. How could God have a plan for Moses to do something for the Hebrews when he had only known ease and freedom? He had been living on their time for 40 years in the lap of luxury. The Egyptians had not prepared him for leading his true people out of slavery. All he knew was how to kick back and enjoy life. That's what it would seem. But something inside of him burned for the freedom of his people. Some of us are still looking for what purpose God has for us. Some know when they're young what they're called into, while others don't find out until they're way older. At 40, Moses had no idea what God had in store for his life. However, he did know that his people were hurting and dying under the rule of the Egyptians, and he felt that their time was needing to come to an end. That's when Moses decides to take matters into his own hands. Personal choices. Moses could no longer stand by and watch his people being hurt. In his anger and rage, he made a choice that would change everything. He struck down this Egyptian man. When word gets to Pharaoh, decree is given. Moses must be punished for his crimes. Moses is to be put to death. So what does Moses do? Does he go and face justice? No, like every good criminal. Moses heads for the hills. He takes off. And he takes off and he leaves everything behind. He leaves everything he knew, everything that he loved, his home, his family, his life. Everything was destroyed in a decision of a moment. How could he possibly recover? You know he didn't have much with him when he took off. But somehow, he survived. But nothing would ever be the same. Moses is now rejected. He's alone. He's afraid. He had made this choice. He decided to run away from his problems. That was something he did on his time. Or that was something he did in their time. Those were personal choices that he made. But now it was his time. I labeled it my time. Moses flees on foot to a place called Midian. Midian's about 300 or 400 miles away from his problems. That's a long way to go on foot. That's a long way to go in a car. Sure, it took him a couple days to get there. Traveling through the wilderness, trying to avoid people, trying to not be recognized. Moses runs and he hides. And he ends up at a well. Thirsty from the journey, he goes to get himself something to drink, and there's these ladies there, and a couple of guys come along and start harassing these women, and Moses stands up and says, "You're not going to do that, not while I'm here." You see, he still had a little bit of integrity going on. He still wanted to defend people, but he still knew what had happened. He still knew what he had done. He still knew that he had murdered somebody. But in this moment, he defended these women that were there, and after defending them from these thugs, he gains the trust of their father, and then he ends up with a wife and a son, far from his problems. Not a care in the world anymore. Nothing to bother him, no one to mess with him. Nobody knows who he is. How far can you run from your problems? How long can you run from your problems? Can you hide from the truth? Listen to this scripture. 1 Peter 2:9, it says this: "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Moses was most definitely in some darkness. We have lived in the darkness until we knew Jesus. But what's really cool about this whole thing is that God has chosen us. He's called all of us, and He has chosen us out of the darkness. We have to accept that choice, absolutely. But He's called us and chosen us into His marvelous light. He is amazing and wonderful above all things. And we need to wake up and realize that it does not matter what we've done. It doesn't matter what's happened to us. It doesn't matter how bad we've been or how good that we've been. God is calling. Our whole lives. Moses is going through living his life, and the whole time God is working on him and calling him to a place that he doesn't even recognize yet. As I mentioned, I personally spent many years trying to dictate my own life, living on my terms, because this is my life, right? I get to make my choices. I get to do what I want to do. Ain't nobody telling me how to live life. You know, I believe in freedom. Ugh. I didn't get this video together, but I want to tell you, a train that is on a good set of tracks has freedom to travel back and forth all over this country. But the moment that train's not on the tracks, it is useless. And when it hits something and it knocks it off the tracks, it's destructive. It will destroy everything that it's in its path. You see, we have this idea and thought that freedom means that there's no rules. Well, we may not. Some people do. That there's no rules. There's no guide. There's no direction in life. We can just do whatever we want. That term anarchy, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Well, you just do what feels good to you. Well, can I kill you? Well, no, that's wrong. Well, how can you determine if that's wrong or not? If you're doing what you want to do and I'm doing what I want to do. If you live in your own little world and I live in my own little world, and you may think that killing somebody's wrong, but I think it's okay, so I'm just going to... That's the idea of anarchy. You just do whatever you want. Well, we got to have some rules. How about morality? How about the idea of who God is? How about living a holy and pure life before God? How about looking to see who He is and what He says? But we still mess it up. Because there's not anybody on this planet that does not know that murder is wrong. It's in our hearts. Moses knew what he had done was wrong. And he's haunted by it. It follows him. But he tries to hide. You see, the thing is, though, that even whenever we've made poor choices, when we have lived in their time, we've lived in our own time, when we stop and listen to the call of God, everything changes. Because God has a purpose. God has a purpose in every one of our lives. He has a purpose in your life, and it doesn't matter what you've done. Moses has escaped into Midian, beginning a new life and starting a new journey. Makes it seem as if Moses had escaped his problems from his past, his families. But after 40 years away, at the age of 80, Moses was getting ready to find out the true purpose of his life. He was about to have a direct encounter with God. Exodus chapter 3, verse 2 and verse 10, it says this, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed." Verse 10, God said, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." We're going to look at that more in depth next week. But the life of Moses had a purpose. And even though bad things happened, even though he made horrible choices in his life, even though he was hiding, God was still calling him out. God still had a purpose for him. And He still said, "I'm sending you." And I want you to know today that God has a purpose in your life. It doesn't matter if you are 5, 50, or 100 years old. God has a purpose for your life. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what has happened to you. It doesn't matter what you have done in life. It doesn't matter how many bad things that you've done. It doesn't matter how many people are out to get you. It doesn't matter. It does not matter when God has a call and a purpose on your life. He wants you to meet Him on the mountain where He can say, I'm sending you. I'm sending you. Some of us sit back. I mentioned earlier that if you don't have somewhere where you're serving in the church, today's a good day to step up. Moses lived in the lap of luxury for 40 years, not having to worry about a thing. For another 40 years, he tended sheep and flocks in a field and had a wife and raised a son. But at the age of 80, just taking care of day-to-day business, not worrying about serving God or anybody else, Moses finally received the true purpose and call in his life. It wasn't their time. It wasn't his personal choices or circumstances. It wasn't even on his own time. It was actually all on God's time. God's timing and God's purpose on Moses' life was all in the works the whole time. Would you stand with me this morning? How long have you run from the true and full purpose that God has for your life? Have you been told that you're never going to become what God has called you to be because of the circumstances and the choices of your life or even other people's lives? And you've bought into that lie and believed that God can't do anything with you and God has no direction for you because you've just been too bad or you've done just the certain things that are wrong and can't be forgiven. Moses was on the precipice of being called to lead an entire nation, his people, into freedom from the Egyptians. The very place that he had ran away from was getting ready to be his destination. How could someone who had run away, someone that was a murderer, be called to lead a nation to freedom? Because not even your personal circumstances can stop the divine call of God, the divine purpose of God on your life. Because when you're called, you're called. And if you say today, Pastor, I don't even know what that calling is, I can tell you, number one, you are called to serve Him with everything that you've got. If you know how to do something and you're not using God or you're not serving God in that thing you know how to do, you're missing part of the call of God in your life. I had a friend that said he was called to be a pastor. I went to church with him for about 9 months. And one day I was asked to take a position as a pastor of a church. And I said, well, how come you didn't ask that guy? And the pastor, he said, well, that guy hasn't lived any of his call the whole time that he's been looking to go pastor a church. He said, Travis, you come to church every Sunday, every time the doors are open, every prayer meeting. You said that even though you know you're called into ministry and you might have to leave, that you're willing to help with Royal Rangers and help sing in the choir. You work a full-time job, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, and you're still willing to show up for everything and do anything. And this guy sits back and complains that God hasn't opened the door for the call in his life. You want to know what the call of God is in your life is? Start serving him with everything that you are, in every way that you can, in every way that you know how, and even in ways you don't know how. Because it's really cool how God will equip you to the call that he has for your life.